Ever since Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock sparked a worldwide revolution in the mid-1950s, pop culture has required knowledgeable, passionate, and experienced mood setters to echo and celebrate the changing face of music. I'm Paul Gambaccini. In 1973, I joined Radio 1 at a pivotal time for British radio. I wasn't alone in the revolution. Whether it was the daring sound of pirate stations, including Radio Caroline, the overt commercialization of Capital Radio, or the intimate atmosphere of local radio, the wireless has always cultivated personalities for every style and mood. In this series, Josh and the team talk to some of the pioneers of music presentation. He will relive some of the moments that defined the British music scene with the figures who saw them and discover the secrets to their longevity. It's time to dust off the record player, adjust your aerial, and fire up the jukebox as we shine a light on the legends of radio, exclusively on Beyond the Title.
So, firstly, Bob, thanks very much for joining us. The striking thing about your early career is that you began as a music journalist, and you've always maintained that despite your vast broadcasting pedigree, you're essentially still a music journalist. From yourself to Danny Baker to Steve Lamacq, why do you think a journalism background helps to nurture the quintessential music broadcaster?
Wow, that's a really good question. I'll just correct it slightly in that I saw journalism as a really good way of getting into broadcasting. So it was a bridge more than a first string to my bow, if you like. Certainly, I've kept up my writing ever since, but primarily I see myself as a broadcaster. But when I started on Old Grey Whistle Test, Mike Appleton, who was the producer and founder of the program, was looking for a journalist who could broadcast. In his mind, it was that way round. And if you look at the presenters of Whistle Test through the years, first of all, with Richard Williams, who was a deputy editor of Melody Maker when he first started on Whistle Test. Then myself, I founded Time Out magazine, co-founded Time Out magazine. So obviously I had a journalistic background. Then Annie Nightingale, David Hepworth, Mark Allen, we were all, in Mike's eyes, journalists who could broadcast. And just explaining his theory about this probably answers the question, in that what he wanted to do was to pass over all responsibility for the presentation of the program to the presenter. So that would involve research, organization of thought, scripting, writing the scripts. And so those skills were very important to Mike in terms of deciding who should be the presenter of the program. And so those skills have helped underpin my career ever since. But primarily, I do see myself as a broadcaster.
You don't. Of course, as you mentioned there, one program shall forever be associated with your understated whispering style. In 1972, you chaired a musical debate on the Old Grey Whistle Test, which would be the start of a long association with the show, which arguably defined your TV career. What were your first impressions of the show?
Well, Josh, I mean, I'd seen Whistle Test as a viewer and a fan in the first series, and I thought it was just such a great program. There was nothing like it at all on TV at the time. And in fact, there were very, very little. It was really only Top of the Pops otherwise. But Whistle Test, I was seeing on Whistle Test all the bands that I absolutely loved. British bands, American bands. I remember seeing Jackson Browne for the first time on Whistle Test, and people like Curtis Mayfield and but British bands that I loved so much. So when Mike asked me if I'd like to come in and do some presentation work, and as you say quite rightly, I hosted a discussion on the Night Assemblies Bill, as it was at the time. It seems amazing now. that the government was trying to prevent any kind of gathering numbering more than about 8 people overnight. It would have effectively ruined festivals, and I didn't know this at the time, but it was a kind of audition. He was putting me through an audition to see how I would be in front of the cameras and everything else. So later, when Richard Williams decided he didn't want to do a second edition of the program, Mike asked me if I would like to take it over. And, I didn't even think about it. Obviously, I said yes. and I then parachuted down into a world which just took my life away into a world that I almost couldn't have ever imagined.
Mm. The Old Grey Whistle Test was unique in so many ways, but from a scheduling standpoint, it really was groundbreaking. At times, the programme could extend beyond the original time slot as a result of it being live and the final programme before close down. Looking back, how significant was this in breaking down some of the formal conservative attitudes that the BBC still held at the time? And what do you think this did to help live entertainment become a little more lucid?
You're right, Josh. It was, we were, not that it lasted that long, but for a while, the program was open ended. It's incredible to think this now. It was the last show broadcast on BBC Two in the evening. So, what was after us was the final announcement, the swirling BBC Two logo ball, and close down. So if one week we had loads and loads of stuff, the program might last for an hour and a half. And if perhaps another week we didn't, it would be 40 or 45 minutes. So that flexibility was great within, in scheduling terms. But it also gave the bands and the artists who came in the opportunity to be themselves. If they wanted to extend their guitar solo, they could. We weren't imposing any restrictions on them. And I think, quite honestly, that the program, bands who came in, artists who came in, felt really welcomed by the program because we were giving them space to completely be themselves. There was no other distraction to it. There was no pyrotechnics or anything like that. The show was all about the music. And I think then, as a legacy, two things. First of all, it inspired a lot of young musicians and music fans, actually, who really locked in to the power and integrity of the program, but also launched some really, or at least exposed some young artists that then subsequently developed an incredible career. People like, from America, people like Bonnie Raitt and Little Feat and the Doobie Brothers, and even people like the Eagles, Jackson Browne. Really, they all had their debuts, Steely Dan, on screen, on British television through the Old Grey Whistle Test. Bob Marley famously made his first ever appearance on the show. So we were giving a platform to music that otherwise probably wouldn't have been heard at that point.
Josh, I remember seeing you on Goodbye Television Centre and you mentioning about how influential the geography of it was and how you were able to do a bit more because you were in London. How do you think it would have been if you were elsewhere?
I think it would have been okay. You know, quite frankly, Josh, I would have travelled hundreds of miles to do that show. I was so happy. But you make a good point, because one of the things that happened that extended the range of the program, if you like, was my first visit to America in 1974. I went to the States to record material for a series called The Beach Boys Story. I went out to America with Jeff Griffin. We went to LA, and we were there for nearly 3 weeks working with the Beach Boys, Carl Wilson in particular, to compile material for that series. And I found myself meeting up with loads of people. I mean, the first night I was there, I met up with Alice Cooper, and we went off to meet up with Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson. And I phoned up Mike Appleton. Oh, are you still there?
Yep.
I phoned up Mike Appleton and I said, this is amazing, you know. I'm meeting up with all these people. If I had a camera crew with me, we could do interviews and we could take those back for the show. So Mike flew out to LA and we filmed a session with Jesse Colin Young. We filmed an interview with Carl, a couple of other things as well. And that set the precedent for us beginning to go out to America gradually more and more regularly, particularly during the summertime, to compile material there and bring it back. So that was one of the most exciting things I have to say about the whole experience of doing Whistle Test, with those trips to America. And we were bringing back with us then performances and music by people who previously had literally never been heard here. So everybody's trying to get hold of me. It's ridiculous. Wait 1 sec. Sorry.
Okay.
My phone's gone mad today. So, for example, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, I introduced them playing at the Whiskey A Go Go in Los Angeles. Talk about a bucket list experience. The Cars the following year, and then people like Dory Previn filming with her in Laurel Canyon, and Stephen Bishop and people. I mean, it was. I couldn't have ever imagined that I would have experiences like this, but it's just one of the most incredible times in my life.
In your opinion, how did Whistle Test create the footprint for a slightly more specialist approach to music programming thereafter? Looking back, what made it different from juggernaut music shows like Top of the Pops?
The look, to start with, we had no budget. I mean, I'm not kidding. We had zero budget. There was a sort of quid pro quo that existed in terms of the relationship between us and the BBC, in that they said, well, we don't really understand what you're doing. We don't have a lot of money for you, but if we just let you get on with it, and that's what they did. So there was nobody looking over our shoulders saying, oh, I don't think you should be showing that film with Frank Zappa, or, we were left to just literally get on with it. We had the freedom because we weren't soaking up a huge amount of their money. In fact, if you can imagine it, my first series on the show, I was getting paid £30 a program. I mean, people don't believe that, but it's true. And my wages went up £10 per series. So by the time that I finished doing Whistle Test, I was earning £100 a show. I mean, I tell the story on stage about organizing the interview with John Lennon in New York, and Mike and I talking to him on the phone to set everything up. And Mike is saying, "Oh, I'll draw up the contract for you, John." And John's saying, "Don't worry, I don't need a contract." And Mike is going, "Yes, no, John, we have to draw up a contract. This is the BBC. So, and we have to pay you a fee." And John said, "How much is the fee?" And Mike said, "Well, it's £15." And those are the sort of sums that we were talking about in terms of the budget for the show at the time. So, I think all of that meant that we couldn't dress the studio. We went into the studio The only sort of expenditure was sort of pulling down some lights, covering them with coloured gauze or whatever. Mike had a big circular Star Kicker sign designed, and then a bit later a bigger one with Old Grey Whistle Test on it. That was about our only expenditure. So when you see those old films now, or footage from the studio, they have such a distinctive look, because you can tell within moments that you're looking at something that had been performed in a bare studio, black walls, wires everywhere, you know.
Yeah.
And so even that vintage footage now is very, very identifiably from those days of the Old Grey Whistle Test.
So in what ways did the landscape of TV Centre help with maintaining that slightly rustic style of the show?
I loved it at TV Centre. I really did. You know, we were up in a tiny studio on the fourth floor in the early days of the program, Pres B. It was otherwise used as a weather presentation studio. You know, then we moved down to TC5, which was also used for Top of the Pops. And at that point, you know, we were able to spread out more. And then everything was live. We could get two bands in, lots of guests, even sometimes, you know, a few friends could be there with us. And so in terms of facilities, Television Centre, I mean, I absolutely loved it there, because the atmosphere of the building, you know, you've got all the other great shows of the day coming from Television Centre, particularly some of the sitcoms and the comedy shows that were based there. Television Centre was the main BBC hub. So you go in there, and let's say you popped into the club for a drink, and you'd be seeing John Cleese across there, Cilla Black talking to somebody in the corner, Bill Cotton, or one of the big variety people, or, you know, just there, the newsreaders wandering around. And you'd be stopping and you'd be chatting, and you'd all have the sense that you were kind of in a family, a big BBC family. And I loved that feeling at the time.
Oh, Josh wrote a film about Bill Cotton. It was for his master's degree. So.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he was, you know, there was Bill Cotton, wasn't there? And then his son, Bill Cotton Jr.
Yeah.
And they were the wellspring of so many of the variety shows that went out on the BBC at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, this period coincided with the creation and development of Radio 1 in 1967, which arguably was a response to the political clampdown on pirate radio stations, including Radio Caroline.
Yeah, it was.
It's a big question, but how significant was pirate radio in developing the sound of modern popular culture?
You can't overstate how massive it was. It was absolutely huge, because the timing was so perfect. You know, the Beatles had burst onto the scene in '63, and they were the arrowhead of a huge surge of British talent that followed, as we know. You know, the Stones, then the Liverpool scene, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and then the Searchers, the Hollies, the Who, the Small Faces. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And the pirate radio stations arrived at exactly the time that this whole Britbeat boom was peaking. So all these records were coming out, and there were radio stations now aimed at young people who were playing them. So they had a huge impact in the development of the careers of all these bands. You know, you go on, I mean, there's so many, the Kinks, we could make a list going on for most of the afternoon, and the pirate radio stations were there, not just playing those records, but also at the time, the musical landscape was so rich. Pamela Motown, Phil Spector, Atlantic, Stax, It was an amazing moment. And the Pirates were, were right in the middle of it all. And out of nowhere came the talent to broadcast on those stations. Tony Blackburn, still going strong. I mean, as we speak, he celebrated his 60th anniversary yesterday. Kenny Everett, again, we could begin to go Johnny Walker, Emperor Roscoe. There were so many great DJs that came out of that moment, some of whom, as we know, is still broadcasting today. So it's impossible to overstate the impact, how important it was. And then, of course, as you say, Josh, when the pirate radio stations were closed down, the government actually kind of semi-instructed the BBC to create some kind of pop service, which led to the start of Radio 1 and Radio 2, 3, and 4 in September 1967. And that would not have happened without the pirates.
Joining Radio 1 in 1970, just 3 years after the creation of the station, and in the era of very rustic experimental approaches to broadcasting, how did you go about making your specialist music style relevant to the free-flowing mood of the time?
Well, I joined a strip of programs called Sounds of the 70s, and they were designed to reflect the new album music that had now begun to really take over. There was a tipping point in 68 where the sales of albums overtook the sales of singles, and the whole sort of progressive rock boom, singer-songwriters, again, David Hepworth maintains that 1971 was the best year ever for music. And when you go through the list of albums in the charts in that year, it's hard to argue. So many of those albums are still relevant today. So Sounds of the 70s was designed to play this new generation of music. It was this Monday to Friday strip, and each evening had its particular emphasis. So on Monday, mine was not exclusively, but more towards singer-songwriters and progressive music. On Tuesday, Mike Harding, it was metal and rock music. Wednesday was the repeat of the concert show, which had gone out on Sunday with John Peel. Thursday was Stuart Henry, which was kind of hippie. And Friday was Alan Black with jazz rock. So each of the programs was designed to reflect certain aspects of this new music that was coming through. So we felt we were very much in the vanguard of what was happening at the time.
Joining Radio 2, then still in an era before Matthew Bannister's Radio 1 revolution, what was the general attitude towards the purpose of national radio at the time? And as someone who had previously been a mainstay on Radio 1, what was your reaction to the overhaul?
I felt at the time, 93 it was, when I was one of the dinosaurs that was forcibly ejected from the building. And there was a bit of a gap between me leaving Radio 1 and joining Radio 2. In that gap, I was broadcasting for the British Forces Broadcasting Service, but more a time that was very happy in my broadcasting life at GLR in London, which again was very much a kind of freeform station. But then there was the change of management at Radio 2. And the previous manager, Francis Lyon, left and was replaced by Jim Moyer. Now, Jim had been head of light entertainment at BBC Television. So he was based, we were talking earlier, at Television Centre, and I didn't know, but he'd become a big fan of mine. So when he took over as station controller at Radio 2, he invited 3 people to join him immediately on the network. One was Steve Wright, the other was Alan Freeman, and the other was me. And that's when I got the call from Jim. It was one of the happiest moments of my entire life. I worked with Phil Swern, absolutely brilliant producer, and we did a little run, I think it was 2 weeks around Christmas time. We all knew that this was my audition, as it were, for Radio 2. And literally at the end of the first program I did, the white light phone went in the studio, and it was Jim saying, I'd like you to call into my office at the end of your series to talk about your future. And I thought, yes. And that's how I started at Radio 2.
When do we play again that he one he very he yeah oh yeah
Joshua, when we spoke to Gary Davis, he said when he left Radio 1, he felt a little bit stuck because he didn't feel old enough to go and join Radio 2 yet. Is that how you felt?
No. No. I was 46 years old. I mean, the thing is, Josh, that at the time, I did understand. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was extremely hurt by the break because I loved doing those programs so much. But I did understand, the Simon Bateses and the Bob Harrises of this world, the Alan Freemans of this world. We were in our 40s. And when you think that Radio 1, it's a young people's station, we weren't necessarily, it wasn't the place for us necessarily anymore. So when it happened, I wasn't completely surprised. But what I did hope was that I would go across to Radio 2 as soon as possible. As it happened, everything's for a reason. And I loved the time I spent at GLR. But when I got to Radio 2, I was definitely, well, how old was I? No, I wasn't 46. I was, wait, let me think. 46. I was 50. I was 50 years old when I started on Radio 2. So I think I was old enough. Gary was quite a bit younger than me, I have to say. He's still quite a bit younger than
me. Securing the late night slot on Radio 2 saw you going up against your contemporary John Peel. What do you think were the similarities and differences between your broadcasting styles, and what's his legacy?
Well, I was a Peel protege. John was so important to me in my early days. It was he that introduced me to Jeff Griffin, who was the producer that took me on to Radio 1. And I was just in awe of John. When I first heard him on the radio, when he was doing the Perfume Garden on Radio London in 1966, 67, that show was everything that I imagined radio could be. If I could have just pressed a button and swapped lives with someone, I would have swapped with John Peel. He was so inspirational to me, and he opened up the pathway really for so many of us to fulfill our dreams. Not just me as a broadcaster, but obviously the musicians that he would support as well. So I took that from him, or at least I was inspired by that from him, in terms of the role then that I was able to play subsequently in the careers of emerging artists. I've kept this going to this day, where new music is incredibly important to me. So I think in personal terms, that would be, I would say that's a huge legacy that John passed on to me, the support of new music. And also in my case, the determination to stick with music I love and not be sidetracked into playing things that I don't really believe in. So yeah, like that, I would say.
What do you like about late night radio? And in your opinion, how different are the needs of the late night audience compared to a mainstream primetime radio?
Given a choice, Josh, it's not that I have intentionally locked myself away into the hours of darkness. I would very much be happy to be broadcasting at a more accessible time. And in fact, when the country show was taking over from Drive at 7 o'clock a few years ago on Radio 2, particularly when Simon Mayo was doing the show, we had an audience of not far off 1 million people, just a tiny bit short of 1 million people, which for a specialist music show, we broke all records, quite frankly. Now, the later in the evening you go, the more the audience begins to diminish. Obviously, it just is natural. It's got nothing to do necessarily with the quality of the programs, but people's life habits. You know, they're going to bed, or they're getting their kids settled, or whatever it is they're doing. So you don't have as many people listening later in the evening. But on the odd occasion, say, for example, when I've sat in for Johnny Walker on Sands and Seventies on Sunday afternoon, where you're back into the millions on that show, and the feedback that you get, and when I sat in for Johnny and Chris Evans actually on Drive some years ago, and you got 5.5 million people listening, you literally can feel the energy off them, and that's an incredible feeling. And so I love broadcasting at a more civilized time of day, if you put it that way.
Yeah. In April 1999, you presented the first episode of Bob Harris Country. What aspects of the Nashville sound were you most determined to convey to British audiences? And in what ways has the show had a front seat to the UK's rediscovery of country music?
I wanted to try and communicate the sense of community I felt in Nashville when I first got there, and the brilliance of the songwriting. You know, country music is all about the songs. It's 3 chords and the truth. And I felt that was a very important bedrock of the program. Also, to promote new artists, to push the door open, to allow country artists to come across here and play gigs and to appear, to create a market for them. Because when I took over the show, people like Brad Paisley, Keith Urban, Alison Krauss were in the very early days of recognition. And I know that I was hugely able to help them create an audience here in the UK. So when you think that the program was on its own in this lane for many, many years until the advent of Country to Country, C2C, in 2013. And then myself and my producer, Al Booth, and now Mark Hagan, and Millie Olican, who was one of the founders of C2C, was standing shoulder to shoulder to create a pathway for country music to do well here in the UK. And I've been the onstage host of Country to Country right from the very first moment of walking out to introduce Christian Bush, who was the first ever artist to appear on the main stage. And it's very sad that Chris York, who was one of the, with Millie, he was the co-founder of C2C, passed away yesterday. So, but I think that the program has been really important. Genuinely, I do. And I'm not saying that arrogantly. If it hadn't been for the country show, my country show, Bob Harris Country, as it was called then, a lot of the artists that we now see having established themselves here would not have had that initial breakthrough. So I'm very, very proud of that. I really am. And now we see how vigorous the country music community is here in the UK. It's the fastest growing music genre in Britain. And that's really quite amazing. I feel very proud of that.
Oh.
Yeah. When more
Just asked, do you think Shania Twain would have had the plot of Glastonbury without it?
Oh, Shania. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm. Yeah, I can't really take any credit for that one, Josh. To be honest, I mean, Shania. There were certain artists that had already established a massive reputation before I came along, and Shania was one of those artists. So I can't and wouldn't even try to take any credit to Shania. She would be filling Glastonbury, whatever happened.
You've recently been on tour with the great Colin Hall with a show, The Songs That the Beatles Gave Away. In your opinion, what would the British musical landscape look like without the songwriting genius of Lennon and McCartney?
I can't even imagine. I mean, I just can't. They made virtually everything that we see and hear around us today possible. I know that sounds like an outrageous claim, but actually it's true. And I can say that because I was there. I watched the phenomenon explode in real time. And there were so many firsts that the Beatles created, not least of which the idea that you can get four lads from Liverpool who are brilliant at writing their own songs. Very few people wrote their own songs prior to the Beatles. Some did, don't get me wrong, Buddy Holly and Roy Orbison and Del Shannon people. But the Beatles made it possible to think that young lads from Liverpool could turn up, be themselves, talk in a Liverpudlian accent, have humour, be brilliant musically, and write great songs. Wow, what a package! And they just birthed through everything and took, as I say, they were the arrowhead that took everything else with them. And then you combine that with, the sense of fashion that was prevalent then. Mary Quant, the models, Jean Shrimpton, Twiggy, the movies. It was really quite an incredible moment for the British popular art, but the Beatles were at the forefront of everything. So, what would life be like without them? I actually can't imagine it. I have no idea. It certainly wouldn't be what we have today.
Just said we've interviewed Jimmy Tarbuck a few times, and he always says that he never would have been able to do what he did without the Beatles and what they were doing. So,
yeah, it's true. And of course, Jimmy was part of that Liverpool generation, if you like. A little, not even a little bit older, but there he was. He could say, well, I mean, even John Peel. John was from Liverpool, of course. And when he went over to America to start his radio career in Dallas, I think it was, he circulated a rumor, or got somebody to circulate a rumor on his behalf, perhaps put it that way, that he was Ringo's cousin. And therefore, just on that basis, he started getting work on American radio. That's how, that's how things were.
Looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
Survival.
Fair enough. You'd be surprised how many people say that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'd say probably 80% of everyone we ask that question to they all say still being able to do it, carrying on.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the thing is, we all know that music and radio and media and, the world in which we live is extremely competitive. So if somehow or another you're still able, as I am, to do what I love, I just think I'm very blessed to be able to say that.
Yeah.
Josh says, yeah, but there always has to be that sort of level of talent there, in his opinion. So,
Well, thank you, Josh. I appreciate that.
specifically looking at your BBC radio tenure, how do you think attitudes towards new music have changed?
What do you mean in terms of styles that are popular, or?
In terms of broadcasters being able to help acts to have the success?
I think it's possibly less. Oh, there's an inherent contradiction in this. I have to be honest, because on the one hand, radio has become more formulaic in so much as so many of the commercial stations, obviously in particular, are playlisted. You know, they're sent. It's that old Mark Cimino song, Rex Bob Lowenstein. They play the playlist that's sent to them in the mail, kind of thing. So there's much less opportunity for DJs there to get behind music they just believe in. However, you know, the BBC remains in a situation where they are able to give their broadcasters a certain amount of freedom, particularly when you get into the more specialist programs like the Country Show or Mark Radcliffe on Folk, or, you know, Keris doing the Blues Show. We do have much more freedom to play the music that we like, and delve around, you know, go right back into the archives, go right back into classic music. The BBC is unique in having this incredible archive, and we're able to delve into that when we want to and can. And so I would say it splits. On the one hand, you've got BBC introducing and things like New to Two. Radio 2 is instructed by Ofcom anyway to highlight 30% new music every week. So, you know, you're hearing curated music on the BBC, and that continues to be a good thing. So I think, I don't know whether that answers the question, but certainly, and you know, you go back to the time that I was doing Sounds of the 70s, it was exactly the same then. Daytime was programmed, playlisted. Johnny Beerling had a great phrase, I thought, when I returned to Radio 1 in the early 90s. And it was ratings by day, reputation by night. So he'd go for massive ratings during the day. And at the time, all those changes were made at Radio 1. I don't know whether Gary would have mentioned this, but Radio 1 had an audience of 19 million. So during the day, they were packing in the audience. And then in the evening, that's when you'd get specialist programs, the documentaries, same at the weekend. That would be the time that Radio 1 would feel that it was good to experiment with its output. So, you know, it's not quite the same now. Those opportunities have squeezed in quite a lot. And that's been something to do with available budgets and other factors behind the scenes. But I think we're pretty much in the same situation, certainly at the BBC, that we were in 50 years ago, let's say.
Really, well,
Josh asked, what's the difference between a radio DJ and a mood setter?
And a mood setter, did you say?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's any. I mean, funnily enough, that's something that you've probably very brilliantly identified from my own shows, because even with the country show, every single week I start with a blank piece of paper, and the idea is to create what I call a flow through, where you start you start at the beginning. You've got a great opening track. If you notice, I mean, you could go back over my shows week after week after week, and the opening track is almost always something that's bright and familiar. And the second track is a come on in track. I specifically choose songs with lyrics that are welcoming you into the program. So you've got 1 and 2, and then 3 probably follows that pattern, where you're still creating this warm, come on in, it's going to be great, you're going to love the music, here are the lyrics that tell you kind of a bit, give you a hint of what's going to happen. And then when you get to track 4, 5, 6, you're getting more into the meat of the program. But every single track, I hope anyway, sets up the next one. And I used to do a lot more segueing than I do now, which really was a flow through. And there, that really is mood setting. But something that I honestly have in my mind every single time I build my programs, Josh, is to try and create this flow through, which is another way of saying setting a mood, I think.
Last question. What's next for Bob Harris?
Hopefully, to carry on the way I'm doing. You know, I really want to, I just want to carry on as long as I can, really. That's not a given, bearing in mind I'm now 78 years old. So it's you know, you thank. There's a great story that one of the roadies that I was working with once in one of the big bands, who were, you know, roadies do have a hell of a lifestyle. And he was saying that he'd wake up in the morning, every morning, open one eye and go, result. And that's kind of a little bit how I feel, you know, that I've been through, as you know, I've been through a lot of health challenges. Thank goodness, right this minute, I've got my health and my strength. But I recognize that's not completely a given. So I just hope to be able to continue doing what I'm doing for as long as I can do it. And that's how I feel.
Yeah.
Sounds a great way to end. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. I mean, I tell you what, Josh, it's fascinating fielding your questions, because every single one of them has made me think, and that's a good thing. So thank you very much. And I'm so glad we did. It's amazing how we both seem to miss each other for about a month or two with our correspondence, but I'm so glad this has happened. And thank you very much for, you know, really putting a lot of thought into the questions that you've asked me. I really appreciate it.